The topic for today was intro to product management, and the goal for me to present in a couple of slides is talk about what is product management at a high level, what are some of the things that they focus on a day-to-day basis, what are the skill sets that are required to be an effective product manager, and practically how did I become a product manager, what was the route that I took. So first, what does a product manager do? Anybody have thoughts? Yes, sir. What's your name, sir?
Jared.
Jared?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Take a product from beginning to end.
That's good. That's right. That's right.
The mini CEO product.
Mini CEO. I like that. That's sexy. That's a good way to think about it. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
The only thing is they work with the engineering team to build the product.
That's also right. One last one. Anybody? No? Bueller? Yes, sir.
Maybe collect in the beginning, collect the customer's needs, and then maybe come out with a product, and then drive the development, and also collect the feedback from customer and consumer support the product.
That's 100% right. So I did not make this. I would love to own this if I could have made it, but I just took this from someone that's very smart. So the left-hand side is, how we're what is the perspective we're viewing it from, and the top is the actual functional roles. So there's certainly way more roles than these three roles in the standard team, but there's obviously a lot of interesting takes on this. Whether you are a research scientist coming up with a cure for cancer, whether you are the next Steve Jobs, or whether you are the leader of the free world. If you think about yourself, you always feel like you're a very important person. Sometimes people think, even when you're working directly with a product manager, you might think they're just a paper pusher, they're not necessarily helping you. On the flip side, as a product manager looking at developers, you may be thinking that this is just the army of people that I'm trying to control. None of that is actually true, right? Everything is kind of skewed. But what exactly does a product manager actually do? So product managers generally are cross-functional leaders. So what's interesting about product management is that generally you're not directly managing anybody, but you are sort of responsible for a portfolio of work. And you are coordinating a group of developers, of QA analysts, of researchers, of data scientists to work on a specific theme of work and deliver a business outcome. And it's related to the first thing that you said, which was identifying the customer need. So what exactly are we trying to solve? And it falls into these three broad themes: technology, business, and users. So what are some of the typical things in these buckets? In the business bucket, and that's sort of where my background came from, was thinking through the opportunity for a specific product. So if you're launching something brand new, is this going to reach 1 million users? Is this going to reach 100 million users? What is the scope of that? What is the revenue monetization potential of that product? Things like that. And it goes into competitor analysis. So who are the incumbents in this space? Is this already a monopoly? Is it a pretty saturated market? Those are some of the things you think about. And stakeholder management is actually really important, especially as you move into larger and larger organizations. If you start out in a startup like I did with about 20 people, everybody that works there, and it's very easy to collaborate. Once you move to a company like TripAdvisor, where there's about 1,000 plus people in the technology organization, there's different levels of hierarchy. You have to get certain things approved before you can actually greenlight your project. Having those connective tissues with the other teams is critical to actually get your product pushed forward. So that's sort of the business aspect of it. On the user side, user interviews. So you may think that you're the smartest person in the world and you know exactly how the user is going to use your product, but you are just one data point, right? So product management is very data driven. You can't just take what you think you're going to do with the product and assume everybody else is going to do the same thing. So going out in the field and actually getting qualitative information, especially in an early stage product, is critical because Google, Facebook, companies like that, and TripAdvisor, they have the benefit of having millions and millions of users hit their site all the time. So it's very easy to see what's trending, what's actually happening on the macro level. When you're starting out as a scrappy startup and you have 10 B2B clients, you don't have that luxury. So you need to get on the ground, actually talk to users face to face, and really dig deep into what are their needs. And then on the technology side, so what's interesting about that specific slice is not all product managers have to be technical. So I majored in electrical engineering, a technical degree, but I didn't have a software engineering background. And a lot of companies in Silicon Valley, they started out with basically product management as a discipline didn't exist, 10, 15 years ago, right? No one majors in product management coming out of college. You can major in software, computer science. You can major in visual design, graphic design, but you can't major in product management, at least back then. Now more schools are doing that. And so generally you see people pivot from tangential areas into product management. For me, that was more of a data-driven analytical background. Some people come from software into product management. There's a lot of people that did QA. And why is that important? When you're QAing things, you actually see the pain points of the users. And so you can actually make that pivot to understand, now I really understand the users. I'm going to take that information and actually drive the product roadmap. Cool. So this is more of a spiel for my background. So as I mentioned, I actually started my career in analytics consulting at Accenture. So studied electrical engineering, went to Boeing to work on satellites, and I realized that industry really moves slow. So typical life cycle to put up, GPS satellite is about 10 years from beginning to end, which is a crazy long amount of time. Imagine what's happened in 10 years, right? So I was like, that's going to be way too long. I'm going to lose interest. I wanted to get into something dynamic. Went into consulting, and I liked it at first because of being able to switch projects, seeing a lot of different industries. But the problem was we would put together an analytical recommendation of here's how we think you should change how you target customers for an upsell or a cross-sell. A lot of the times they would take that recommendation and they would just put it on shelf. So I didn't actually see all the hard work that our team put into recommendation actually implemented in the system at the company. And so that kind of demoralized me for a while. I went kind of on like a quarter life crisis, was searching jobs all over the place. And then at that time, I just wanted to find an opportunity where I would have a lot more ownership of the end-to-end. And so I applied for a startup here, and I actually went in a dual role, so sort of a client services role, which was my background at Accenture, working directly with the clients, and also analytical product management. So that's kind of when I made the pivot. And my domain knowledge of working with clients on analytical solutions allowed me to craft a product roadmap for the BI suite at that company. And so once I made that transition, I basically fell in love with product management. And since then, I've been very lucky and fortunate to have had a couple of different opportunities that kind of span the 2x2 here. So just to explain this a little bit, the x-axis is mapping the maturity of a company, so startup to mature, and the y-axis is spanning a consumer-focused product and an enterprise-focused product. So Gen.Video, which still exists today, originally was focused on a community of members that actually would do product reviews. So if you use, Tide Pods, or if you bought an LG product, we would actually get video reviews from that user. We would incentivize them with points, like Amex points, something like that, and then we would syndicate that content out to the brands. So big conglomerates like Procter & Gamble, LG was a client, would actually take that content and distribute it online on Amazon, on their branded sites, and the whole business model was enhanced content was going to be more compelling than just written text reviews. And so that's what that startup was, and that's when I worked on the BI piece. On the next place I went was Palantir. How many people are familiar with Palantir? A couple folks. And that jump for me was really a passion jump. And so I loved all the people that I worked with at Gen.Video. A lot of the people I invited to my wedding. And it was very tight-knit because it was a startup of about 20 people. But the actual product itself, I wasn't super passionate about. So I wanted to find something that the mission of the company was something that I was super passionate about. Palantir, for the people that aren't familiar with the company, the PayPal co-founders, Peter Thiel, if you heard that name, they developed an internal product to help with fraud detection. So early days in PayPal, they had a lot of issues with fraud, people hacking PayPal, siphoning off money, and they originally tried to solve it with an algorithm. So, detect certain patterns, figure out that's fraud, flag it, and kick that person off. The problem was the fraudsters were too smart and they would actually be able to work around the algorithm. And so they developed a comprehensive suite of products that took the best of both worlds, machine and humans. So it empowered data analysts at PayPal to use some of the algorithms, but also overlay their own intelligence to identify fraud. And that actually helped lower fraud heavily at PayPal. What they ended up doing was taking that product and applying it to the government space. So obviously post 9/11, there were a lot of people passionate about trying to solve counterterrorism. They went to the government space, actually got funding from the government VC to develop a suite to help them with counterterrorism. And so that's originally how Palantir came about. It actually was in stealth mode for about 3 years, which is kind of crazy. You don't see that now with startups. You can do that when Peter Thiel's bankrolling you though. When he's the first investor in Facebook, he has some money to actually pad that. You don't really see that with startups like Gen.Video. It's very hard to get Series A, Series B without seeing like actual traction. So I moved out to Palo Alto for a bit to work with some of the leadership there, but my family's on the East Coast, so I came back and I worked at Rockettrip. Rockettrip is an interesting company. It's a Y Combinator-backed startup, and essentially Google started this product and initiative internally that incentivized people to save on their corporate travel. And so they would have Google points for travel. So if you spend less, Google would actually reward you points. You could use those points to upgrade to first class the next time. They took that concept and basically exploded it out to all different corporations from SMB to enterprise. And essentially what it would do, it would set a budget based on an algorithm. So say your company allows you to spend, $500 on a certain complete package, whether that's hotels, car rentals, flights, etc. They would understand that, set the budget for you at $500. If you spent $200, you actually saved the company $300. $150 would go to you, $150 would go to the company. Everybody wins. So that was the actual business model there. And that was a SaaS model so that they would actually license it out to the clients. And so the biggest thing there was trying to figure out what the sweet spot was for keeping people coming back. So the question always is, once you change the culture at a company, why use Rockettrip after that? Like if you fundamentally change people doing this behavior, why can't you just do that in-house? And that was one of the challenges that they're actually wrestling with there. And most recently at TripAdvisor, I've been focusing on the consumer application. People use TripAdvisor here, hopefully. They got a cool new app coming out for social. So at TripAdvisor, I work on the hotels experience and kind of went back to my roots in data and analytics. We're building out essentially a platform to help us deploy algorithms for how we should serve up the best hotels for a user. So if you guys are familiar with TripAdvisor, it has a lot of different reviews across a bunch of different travel items, whether it's hotels, restaurants. They acquired Viator, so a lot of the experiences that you go on. I focus on hotels, which drives the majority of the revenue for TripAdvisor. And what's interesting is when you search something in Google, I feel like everybody kind of trusts the results that Google spits back to you. How many people actually click on something below the top 5 results? Not many, right? You kind of expect Google knows what they're doing. I'm going to pick one of the top 3 things. Similar case with TripAdvisor. If we sort the results for a large geo like New York City, where there's thousands of hotels, people are only going to go through page 1 of results. So showing you which ones are on page 1 is critical, not only to the user, but also to the monetization. Obviously, the hotels care a lot about that. So there's bidding dynamics associated with it. So if, for example, the Westin Grand Central, that hotel, obviously, you can go to their site, book rooms there, but there's also resellers. So people, I'm sure, have used Priceline, Expedia. They actually buy blocks of rooms for that hotel, and they sell it as a third party. So everybody's competing for people to actually click on that, and how TripAdvisor monetizes is through referrals. So once you click, every click actually becomes a qualified lead, and that's how we make money. So that's kind of the spiel on my background, and I think for me, I'm really excited about being a product manager instructor at product school, and I think my background is kind of varied and diverse, more so than most, because I've seen kind of the startup life and what that's like. I've also worked at very mature companies, and I've also spanned B2B and B2C. So people that are interested in kind of all four quadrants, I feel like I have relevant experience to share with everybody and talk through that. Cool. So I think that's it. We're going to get Xavier up here for Q&A.
My name's Edmund, and I'm
Hey, Edmund.
in product development for Arrow, and we use like product management systems. What type of software in product management are you using to track?
That's a good question. I feel like no one's really got a good answer for that yet. And I think it's because with each team, there's different preferences. And if you are an engineer or if you work with engineers, they are the people that are actually building the software. And it's like if we take like another industry, like construction, they're people that are actually putting together the building. Like imagine you just went up to someone and it's like, hey, stop doing that. We got to talk about this random thing for like an hour and then go back to building the building. There's a lot of distractions that actually make it inefficient. I think project management in general, we want to minimize the distractions and actually focus on things that matter. And so there's tools like Jira, which allow you to plan sprints, understand what work you're working on, but it also requires engineers to provide input into that. And so Jira is a very complicated system. There's so many ways you can configure it. And what ends up happening is a product manager feels like, hey, I got this great idea. I'm going to make this super complicated, super hard to use, and then no one's going to use it. And that's generally what happens. So instead, usually what ends up happening is, have you guys heard of Trello? Like boards like that. Try to minimize the friction for the people working on it. And then usually at the higher level, like at the executive level, if you're trying to do a readout of what the 3 to 6 month roadmap is, use more robust softwares like Monday.com is something that we use to kind of keep track of roadmaps so that you can show people what you're working on, but day to day, you're not actually getting people too much in the weeds that it's slowing them down.
So I work in sales and trading, and considering transition to product management.
Cool.
When have you worked with folks who kind of made that jump from business finance world? What skills they brought to the table, what's been beneficial to them that's made them successful in product management?
Yeah. So you're a trader right now?
Sales, yes.
Sales. So my previous manager actually came from a finance background as well. And I think in general, having, being comfortable with numbers and being analytical and having that mindset is really valuable as a product manager. And I think it kind of goes back to this slide where sort of it's ebbed and flowed in terms of where people feel like you need to focus in terms of your skill set. And I would say each company is different in terms of like what they favor. So Google came out with their sort of prestigious associate product manager program, which Marissa Mayer actually came up with. And so very early on, it was like you had to be an engineer. That was like hard requirement. But nowadays, going back to what you said, people really care about understanding the user problem. Requires no technical background at all, right? You just need to have empathy and be willing to understand what the user pain points are. And so I think I'm kind of the mindset that having a balance of all those things is important. And when you're trying to get your first product manager role position, highlighting your strengths in the areas that you are already strong in is important. But being open and being willing to learn and kind of be outside your comfort zone in the other areas is kind of like the way to get your foot in the door. And then if someone gives you that opportunity, like I was fortunate enough to have that opportunity at the startup, then you just got to prove it with hard work. Yes, sir.
Thanks for taking the time to speak to us today, by the way.
Sure.
My name is Dan. I also have a background in finance. So when you made your transition into your PM role, did that startup have like an onboarding program to help you learn about product management, or did you have like a mentor? Like how did you get exposed to like all the different tools and I guess like the day-to-day, like long-term, things that you have to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think in general, if it's like your first product job, it's going to be very hard to go work for like a Facebook or a Google, right? It's like very competitive at those places. and generally you end up at a startup or a middle-sized company. And what's kind of problematic about that is they don't have a lot of best practices, right? So it's, it's a very scrappy, there's not a lot of time to build onboarding materials or training. And so I really had to be sort of a self-starter and do a lot of research into understanding what's out there. Luckily, there's the internet, and Google is very helpful with that. And there's a lot of product manager bloggers that I follow. Ken Norton is one of them. That was an early Google engineer that transitioned into product management. And people, actually, Peter Thiel did an entire class at Stanford, which was the precursor to 0 to 1. Have you guys heard of that book? So a lot of people are willing to share their knowledge and put it out there in the internet. And I think that's common in tech now, right? Is you can't just kind of rest on your laurels and not have to worry about learning anything anymore. Especially for technology engineering, they're always trying to keep up with the latest frameworks. On the product side, you have to do similar things, understanding, what are the best practices, what is the evolution of user research, for example, what's the next thing with design systems. And for product managers, I think the breadth of what you have to cover is actually probably larger than most because it's such a cross-functional role. So like, what are the best practices for data analysis? I love the tool Looker. I don't know if anybody uses Looker, but I was a big just general SQL power user before when I was in data and analytics. I actually use SAS, not SaaS, but SAS. It's a software that's like in Fortune 500 companies, you actually have to pay a massive license fee to use. Nobody does that anymore because Python is free. So, just like getting your hands dirty and like actually learning it, I think is critical.
From your experience, what has been the hardest thing about being a PM?
The hardest thing about being a PM. She asked, what was the hardest thing about being a PM in my opinion? For me personally, I think the hardest thing, and this is sort of a personal thing, I think I didn't realize how much of the stakeholder management piece was going to be part of my day-to-day job. And not only that, the day-to-day operational hand-holding that you have to do, especially at startups. Product managers end up being the glue to kind of keep the product running. Generally at a startup, people say there's a product, but usually there's like a guy in the back room and he's like typing in numbers. Like that was me, like that was the product manager, because you are intimately familiar with the product, you know what the bugs are, you know what the data is, and whenever there's a gap, engineer is going to probably take 2 to 4 weeks to actually build a solution. So what are you going to do in the meantime? You're actually going to be the solution. And so that's something people don't realize until they get into it. And I think you have to be willing to embrace that pain. Like you have to love that pain so much that you no longer want to be in that pain anymore and fix it.
Okay, so my question is, so what percentage of the time you spend on a daily basis that you're actually trying to be creative and create something new?
So I think it varies. So right now I'm working on a pretty greenfields project. So in a greenfields project, you don't really have a set number of requirements. You're kind of doing discovery work, and discovery work usually involves looking at the current state, what the competitors are, a lot of the stuff that you see in the business bucket. And that's what people would probably classify as like the fun part of product management, right? You get to define something from scratch and build that product. That doesn't happen all the time. Like that just depends on the life cycle of what I'm working on. I've also worked on at TripAdvisor large releases of an incremental feature. And this is another kind of theme you'll see is a company like TripAdvisor or a Facebook or Google. They've been around for so long. There's rarely like a new product launch that you get to own from scratch, right? Generally, you're improving an existing product to make it better. And even that, can be very interesting and exciting. And I would say 25% of my time generally is thinking up the roadmap. So what are we trying to do 3, 6, 9 months from now? About 40% of it is just like tactical day-to-day, sprint planning, sprint management, project management, talking to users, trying to figure out what the bugs are. And then there's a lot of spec work, and spec work is actually like writing the documents, the requirements, and that's probably the remainder of my time.
Have you been involved in product pricing?
Product pricing?
Yeah, how'd you go about it?
So like actually pricing the product to the end consumer. So more so on the B2B side, not so much on the consumer side. So on the B2B side, it's kind of a more structured exercise, if that makes sense. It's not like a product manager says, I feel like this is worth X dollars, and then you just sell it for that. I partnered with our internal finance team and essentially did a bottom-up analysis. So like, what is the total cost of building this product? What margin do we want to make on it? And then kind of like some wiggle room of how much do we want to lower that margin so we actually get people to buy the product. So it wasn't an exact science. And generally, most things in product management aren't exact sciences. You kind of do something, do it completely wrong, and then figure out like what you need to change.